This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura and Johannes. I appreciate the invitation to join for the workshop, and look forward to watching some of the talks and joining some of the discussions today, the rest of today and tomorrow. And yeah, so my orientation to this material is Buddhist studies, and I come up having done my PhD in Buddhist studies, and then I lived in Tibet for several years in a monastery and did training in a monastery in northeastern Tibet. And then I worked on field projects in Tibet for about 12 years. And over the last decade plus now, I've been working at the intersection with scientists, mostly in neuroscience and cognitive sciences more broadly, to sort of think about Buddhist models of the mind. And more specifically, the majority of my research comes out of what's called the contemplative sciences. So, meditation research, and the research I conduct here, I've set up a lab over the last few years. We do experimental work, an interdisciplinary lab, bringing humanists and scientists and artists and technologists, makers and practitioners together to sort of think together around how different contemplative practices work and understand their underlying operative dynamics as well as the experiences that arise from them. In order to do that, understanding the mind is fundamental. And one of the areas that the Buddhist traditions have placed a lot of their efforts in discerning over the last 2.5 millennia are typologies of the mind and descriptive ontologies of the mind. What I'm going to walk you through today is not meant to be exhaustive by any means. We could certainly do a whole lecture, a whole seminar. You could do a whole degree. You could spend your career on this kind of material. However, today, really leaning into this idea of non-dual, and this idea of non-dual awareness, gets NDA is the abbreviation you'll see in the meditation scientific research literature, and how Buddhists have articulated that. And in particular, I'll be drawing from two traditions, meditative traditions in Tibetan Buddhism. One is called Dzogchen and the other is called Mahamudra. So to give you an outline of what I'll be walking through today, I'm going to begin by sort of discussion of the structure of consciousness, how consciousness is understood to be structured most fundamentally within the Buddhist paradigms that I'll be discussing. Secondly, I'm going to draw attention to what I call asymmetries of consciousness. That is to say that there's a dual fold, a twofold thinking around what consciousness is. In particular, we'll talk about it in terms of awareness, ordinary versus pristine or pure awareness, and I'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about, well, what is this pure awareness and how is it characterized? I'll then draw from the Dzogchen tradition most elaborately, and then I'll more simplistically, but also give a nod to the Mahamudra tradition. And then we'll conclude with some reflections on the nature of mind and where this might take us as researchers and scientists, philosophers, and so forth, practitioners. Okay, so here we go. So these are two articles that I wrote. I'll mention another article as we get into the presentation. The first one, Rangjung Dorji's Variegations of Mind, Ordinary Awareness and Pristine Awareness in Tibetan Buddhist Literature, is one that I would recommend as background for many things I'll be discussing today. This other one I put out the year before last on cognitive illusion, also is more related to dreaming, dream yoga practices, but very sections are also very related to what I'm talking about today around operations of perception and cognition. So that just as a way of sort of background. And I want to begin by just sort of talking about Buddhist structures of consciousness. And when we talk about consciousness from the Buddhist perspective, at least the Buddhist traditions that I'll be discussing and detailing today, there's very particular structures of consciousness that are understood and implicit. So I'd just like to make them somewhat more explicit. And the first thing is to understand that if we're going to embark on this, that there's a discernible underlying structure to human experience that reifies subject-object intentionality from moment to moment. So this is sort of a baseline understanding that I'm going to unpack throughout this presentation today, but it's really where I want to begin. It's understood to be a kind of baseline, and it's not an assumption per se. It's something that's discernible, something that's experientially discernible. But nonetheless, in order to have the conversation, it's fundamental. And I'm going to use two phrases sort of back and forth. One is subject-object intentionality. And by that, I mean the arc of the subject towards the object and as an interrelational arc. And I mean intentionality here in the way that Husserl uses it in a phenomenological sense of in a kind of experiential towardsness, the phenomenal world from the subjective. And the other phrase that I'll use is subject-object complex, and by that I literally mean the coupling of the mind and the world. So such an architectonic gesture of consciousness shapes lived experience. That is to say, this is not something that's understood by these traditions to be trivial, but more so fundamental. And that it's also something, as I mentioned, can be discernible, but more so, it's happening all the time. It's happening as I speak right now. This kind of what I call an architectonic gesture. That is to say, the way that we sense and perceive and form cognitions as embodied beings in a phenomenal world lend themselves habitually to this kind of gesture, and that's what shapes lived experience. That's what gives rise to consciousness, and I'll talk about that. Okay? So this kind of architectonic gesture that gives rise to, again, this kind of subject-object intentionality there's many ways to think about it, but one in the Buddhist traditions called the five skandhas. Here I'm referring to the fivefold unfoldment process. And it's important, I think, to begin to think in these terms. And I'm going to discern here and five factors that are understood to be aggregates. That is to say, on their own, as each of them as an isolated factor does not give rise to consciousness, but the first four give rise to consciousness, which is the fifth. And that this is a process. It's a process that's unfolding. It's unfolding momentarily in our experience that gives a kind of dynamical situatedness to that architectonic gesture that I mentioned. And the first is simply that we have a body. And by having a body, it means that we are an organism, and that our organism has the capacity of the five sense faculties: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. That is to say, these five are fundamental for discerning the phenomenal world. That we are sense makers, that humans are fundamentally, primarily sense makers, that we make sense of our world through our senses and our sense capacities. And that, as we'll see, these correlate with the phenomenal world in very particular ways. But fundamentally, this, will often get uh, translated as form. There's different ways to sort of think about it, materiality, matter. But fundamentally, what they're talking about is the organism that has the capacity for sense making. Okay. And second is that with senses, that there is sensation. That is, with a body, that we have not only the capacity of the sense faculty to discern objects, but there's a multiplicity of every possible sensation, right? That sensations can range from pleasant and blissful to unpleasant and painful to utterly neutral or neither pleasant and unpleasant. And that this kind of spectrum along the gradation from sort of, we can think from pain to reward, if we want to think in those kind of psychological paradigms, that's fundamental to how we are as sense makers in a phenomenal world. That's not something that happens outside of us. That's not something that happens without us. It is implicit to having a body and the five senses. And as we experience pleasure and pain and neutrality and so forth, then we begin to have ideas about what they are. We begin to sort out, we begin to isolate, to label our experience as such. And this process is called conception. And I'm going to talk about this more succinctly, but fundamentally here, sensation lends itself to not only detecting the phenomenal world as an embodied being, but more so to conceiving the world as such. That there are then conceptions, that are ideas, concepts that are laid upon the world, and they're imputed upon the world in ways that are constructed by language and culture and habits of attention that indelibly shape this architectonic gesture, again, all part of this manifold process of unfoldment. And in so doing, with conceptions in the world that have sourced from sensations, that have sourced from the very organism uh, that we are, that humans are, there are what are called formations, these samskara. That is to say, there's kind of an impressionistic space in which we then can decide, we can make those conceptions, we can actualize them, we can further conceive them, we can make decisions about them. Okay, there's a kind of volitional action and momentum that occurs because of this, the first three. And with that, there's a kind of complexity that emerges. And that complexity of this fivefold unfoldment process that gives rise to this architectonic gesture of the subject-object intentionality is what's called consciousness. And that is to say, consciousness is fundamentally here, the Sanskrit is vijnana. The consciousness here is fundamentally the five sense faculties, including the mental sense, so the five that I outlined earlier, a six called the mental sense, and the mental faculty. And as an aggregate, that is, as a whole process, this unfoldment is what's called consciousness. Okay? So, with that as a kind of background, then let's sort of think here about what we're talking about. In particular, there's sort of this idea that a moment of consciousness arises because of deep contingencies of the faculty of the senses, including the mind. So the sixth sense faculty, as I've outlined, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind, the sense faculty, you may call it the mental faculty if you like. And six correlative objects, that is to say, phenomena that we can see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think about, right? So phenomenal, sensible objects in the world. And these give rise to six modalities, six modes of consciousness. That is to say, consciousness is, as I mentioned in the last slide, the aggregation of this fivefold process, but it's also manifold, right? We have a particular consciousness through these different channels. And as an aggregate, they're sort of processed through the mental channel and so forth. There's further subliminal channels. But this gives rise to a moment of consciousness. That is to say, a moment of consciousness occurs automatically when a sensible object comes into its corresponding sense domain and interacts with, connects with, has a moment of contact, an instance of contact with a correlative sense faculty. So this is what's fundamentally, we could call it cognition, and cognition in its complexity is consciousness. But an instant or a moment of consciousness or cognition here has to have all these different alignments. So it's not merely that we have a mind, nor is it merely that there's a phenomenal world out there, but it's the correlation and the correlation with, a healthy sense faculty, an unobstructed domain, and a phenomenal object. Okay, so it's the capacity, the organ, and the object, you could say. In that instant of interaction where there's this coming together, this kind of contact, the faculty of, so then these are further kind of faculties of the mental faculty, of the faculty of mind. There's a faculty of cognition, or what I'll call cognitive selectiveness, that operates in tandem with a cognitive faculty called discernment to reflexively apperceive and mediate the contents of consciousness. So at that moment, where there's an arise of a moment of consciousness, there's then these two operative cognitive faculties at work to both select the object and discern it. Okay? To select the object and discern it. So this is at like the micro level of consciousness. And this is likened to this moment of discerning an object, selecting and discerning an object in the immediately succeeding instance of immediate sensory perception. That is, at this interactive moment, at the arising of consciousness, these two subtle yet inseparable faculty, right, selectiveness and discernment, select and steadily consider the presence of discrete, discontinuous moments of awareness. So they're sort of honing in on this discrete moment of awareness, whether it be a thought or, a taste or a sight, etc. Like a bumblebee hovering over and inspecting a honeysuckle blossom. So there's this kind of really interesting analogy of we're constantly hovering over these moments of a consciousness that rise. It's not that we're hovering over reality, is that reality is made, if you will, constructed as a consciousness arises momentarily, and then there's this kind of selection and suspension happening. And that then is all part of consciousness and what I'll talk about and sort of frame the language in ordinary awareness. This is now talking about consciousness as it frames itself in our ordinary experiences, sleeping, dreaming, waking, along the spectrum of ordinary awareness. And by ordinary, I mean deeply habituated according to these patterns of the architectonic gesture, based on the five sense faculty plus the mental faculty that operate we thus operate correlative with the sensible world to divide and discern the features of what is knowable according to its spatial and temporal reference. So with this selection and discernment, there's then a bifurcation of awareness itself with the object that is arisen in consciousness. And this becomes this kind of bifurcation process, which is what I began with, the fundamental underlying subject-object intentionality, the structure of dualistic awareness, which I'll call ordinary awareness. Um, Another way to think about this is consciousness is cognizing through discerning the essence of sensible objects. So consciousness is constantly discerning and making sense of, and in its very cognitive selectiveness and discernment, it's also bifurcating. It's making this kind of dualistic framework of the subject-object intentionality, and that becomes deeply habituated to the point that it becomes the primary feature of ordinary awareness or consciousness. So in this way, awareness is dichotomized, not due to exterior reference nor to interior awareness. Rather, duality, dualistic awareness, occurs due to a nexus of interrelational factors that allow for perception and cognition to emerge as a concomitance of the sense organs, the sense faculties, and their sensible phenomena. So even though it feels like it's me and I'm in a world, or there's a body in a world, or a mind in the world, what they're actually saying is that these are intrinsically um, interrelated in this nexus of factors and contingencies that give rise to this felt sense of a dichotomy. And that process is a kind of dynamic unfolding process. And the consequence is dualistic experience, that is to say, a felt separateness between interior awareness and exterior reference. We feel separate from the world. The very processes of dualistic perception give this feeling. And the structuring of the subject-object complex is based on the bifurcation of the percept from the perceiver at the instance of perception. And for this to occur, there must be the subjective perceptual fixation on an object of fixity. Okay? So this then lends itself to a whole habituated mode of being where there's what's called grasping or fixation. Then the object becomes something of fixity, and there's a whole kind of, entrenched paradigm of the habituated ordinary consciousness that plays out. And this is the fundamental dynamic, not that subject and object are intrinsically divided, but that because of this dynamic, there's a subject-object complex that arises when they're in contact. Okay? Thus, human consciousness bifurcates interior awareness with external reference, and in so doing, iteratively operates as a tapestry of feedback loops with the world. So as we do this moment to moment, this is happening instantly, instant, and it becomes so deeply habituated, these traditions claim, that there's a kind of tapestry of feedback loops. We are then imposing on the world what we think it is, and then that world is feeding back to us what we understand it to be, and then consequently every action, every movement, every word or thought furthers these seamless loops that we become indelibly embedded in these kind of infinite loops through these gestures. And thus, we're indelibly looped in deep contingencies of sensation, perception, cognition, and interpretation of the world in which we live in. Okay? and that the body receives the world to assume a certain sensorium. So this kind of looping effect then creates the sensorium, the world of the sensing, of the sense maker in which we live. And as such, duality is an active construct. As I began with, the subject-object complex becomes a kind of embedded in structure that's habituated and assumed. However, just to keep the conversation very open, our human sensorium is not, however, the sole arbiter of reality. And as we know from other life forms, more of reality can be sensed. There are life forms such as turtles and dolphins and bats and bumblebees, etc., that navigate the world in ways that we cannot detect. Infrared light and vibrations, and so on and so forth. That is undetectable to our sensorium, to our domain of human consciousness. So this all lends itself very well, I won't go into it too much, but to predictive models. And there's a whole kind of paradigm about everyday kind of perceptual inferences and simulations that the brain make. I'm sure many of you are familiar with predictive coding, this idea of a controlled hallucination and so forth. I just want to sort of give a nod to this because if you're understanding what I'm saying, that may be something that you intuit. And I've written a little bit about this. It's also something that the Buddhist traditions have talked about, and they use a whole set of similes of illusion, where they're talking about how a kind of uh, illusionism is not in the strong sense, but in the sense of a metaphoric illusion, is a descriptive way to talk about these kind of deep looping effects of the structures of duality. So, how am I doing with time? Did that just take like all my time? Laura, you're on mute.
There you go. Yeah, you got 20 more minutes, so you're fine.
All right, including discussion.
No, excluding discussion.
Oh, great. All right, cool. So that just sort of sets up, consciousness and as ordinary awareness. And I think I haven't met you before, but I'll just speak for myself. But you know, that's how we most of us experience and access our life through ordinary awareness. And that's when we're thinking about consciousness, that's the predominant paradigm. It's a predominant paradigm in Buddhist models of mind, but more so it's the kind of paradigm of human consciousness, at least as presented here according to Buddhist thinking and sources. But then they say that there's a kind of asymmetry to that dynamic, that there's a kind of flip side, if you will, to ordinary awareness. And that gets called pristine awareness or pure awareness. So this is very important and really the kind of main point I want to make today when we're talking about paradigms of consciousness. If we're thinking about a kind of paradigm or models of consciousness from the Buddhist perspective, then one of the contributions that these traditions, as well as other non-dualistic traditions, non-dual traditions have to make is that there's another dynamic of the mind, and that all of consciousness is not subsumed by these kind of deep contingencies of subject-object intentionality. But yet, as you'll see in this very kind of simplistic graph that I made, there's different discernments or distinguishing gestures they make about these asymmetries of consciousness. And in these traditions, Tibetan Buddhist traditions that I study, the contemplative or meditative traditions, uh, this is the first thing you do as a meditator who's practicing in these traditions is you start an exercise. In Tibetan, we call it shenje, and it literally means making the distinctions. And the exercise is to try to understand first conceptually and intellectually, and then experientially through practice, what is ordinary awareness, as I've described it in the first part of my talk, and then what it isn't, what is pristine awareness. And in the same way, these are then different articulations. So, what is the mind or the ordinary mind, and what is the nature of mind? Or what is ignorance, which gets called marikpa, and what is the opposite of that, which is this sort of pure baseline awareness called rigpa. So, in this way, you're sort of very intentionally making discernments between what is and what isn't sort of consciousness as we know it as ordinary awareness, and consciousness, you could say, in its more pure or pristine expressions. And that's not obvious, and it's not something that's yeah, that's necessarily obvious to most people. There's also in the meditative traditions ways of talking about this as technique and method, meditative technique. I have this chart here outlines two styles of mindfulness, and I won't go into this in detail. If you're interested, I've written a paper on this that with my colleague Marc-Henri Desroches that outlines how non-dual awareness and non-dual techniques of meditation are differentiated from what gets called dualistic mindfulness, or sort of techniques, contemplative or meditative techniques that are designed but also have their limitations due to reifying kind of dualistic structures. And if you're interested, you can check that out. So that's all just to make this kind of very clear distinction. So first half was talk about what is consciousness and its ordinary expressions as awareness. Now understanding that there's a kind of asymmetry, that there's a kind of flip side of consciousness, if you will. And now we're going to turn to talking about that flip side, that is to say, characterizing pure awareness itself. So there is a term, a kind of technical phrase that's become embedded in the scientific and the meditation research literature called non-dual awareness. In the midst of writing a review about that right now, with some of the thoughts that I'm talking about today. But it's good to know as a reference, and there's different ways of characterizing non-dual awareness, at least as it's in the literature, the contemporary, research literature. But this is sort of how, in sum, how it's come to be known and denoted. Non-dual awareness, or NDA, is increasingly characterized as a qualitative reorganization of consciousness, marked by attenuation of narrative and minimal self processes, and described as a stabilization of non-agentive, non-conceptually structured awareness, a description that resonates with phenomenological reports of self-loss and dissolution, personal narrative, and non-dual awakening. So, as you'll see, there's a lot of buzzwords in there, but this is the kind of, at least in our current characterization in the review of the literature, how we understand it's come to be described. In the Buddhist paradigm of consciousness, we talk about pure awareness, and I'll talk about it in two distinct ways, but fundamentally as defined as an empty, lucent cognizance that abides through the natural continuum of all sentient beings. That is to say, this is not something you learn or something that you gain or acquire. This is not something that needs to be trained in, although there's methods for training and its recognition, but nonetheless, but more so, it's there as these traditions propose and claim as a natural continuum of consciousness itself, or of sentience, of the sort of fundamental sense making um, uh, that conscious beings are. So I'm gonna now talk specifically to one meditative tradition in Tibetan Buddhism called the Dzogchen tradition, mostly from Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. There's also forms of Dzogchen in the Bun tradition, and I think I have one slide that references some Bun sources, but my orientation's really Dzogchen Nyingma traditions, in the Nintig, or sort of heart essence traditions from from the 11th century up until the present day, you could say. Anyways, so here there's a term called Rigpa, which I'll just translate as pure awareness, but the word itself in a colloquial sense just means to know or to be aware. And it's not a fancy word. We use it all the time in Tibetan, just speaking, to mean to be aware of something or to know something. But its opposite is madrikpa in Tibetan, and that gets translated as ignorance or misknowing or to be unaware. And this is also a technical term. In fact, it's the first in the 12 links of interdependence. So if people know famous Sipe Korlo, the wheel of existence that you'll see painted on monastery walls, or tanka paintings, etc., of this kind of wheel of existence. There's 12 links throughout the whole wheel. The first one, where it all begins, the link of origination for what's called dependent origination, is this fundamental misknowing, this fundamental not being aware of awareness in its most reflexive, baseline, fundamental expressions. So that you could say that fundamental misknowing or misapprehension of the mind itself, of awareness itself, is what triggers all of, in Buddhist parlance, samsara, which means the infinite cycles of pain and stress and delusionment that make up and characterize the dualistic frame of ordinary awareness, as I discussed. But then there's this other term called, I talked about mind, or the mind itself, or the nature of mind. Okay? So there's a term for awareness that occurs colloquially and technically across genres and contexts. It's not a special term, although I'm using it in the Dzogchen context as a special term, but really referring to awareness itself, or what I'll call for the rest of this talk, pure awareness. Pure awareness. So the features of pure awareness, or Rigpa, they say there's two threefold structures. There's two tripartites, right? The first is that its essence is empty. Its nature is clear, or clarity, clear light. Its capacity is pervasive care. And these three, being empty, means here that there's no intrinsic substance that can be identified. There's no color or shape, there's no weight, there's no phenomenal or material substance that can be identified. That it has clarity means that it can be seen through, like you can see through a window, transparent, but that also it can see, that it can observe. And that because of this clarity or transparent quality, it can know. And third, that its capacity as care or pervasive care means that fundamentally it's oriented towards collapsed or painful modes of expression in order to relieve that pain. And so that's called care. So this is interesting. Um, One, it's non-reified. Two, it is epistemic. And three, it's oriented towards care. That's very interesting. A lot to say about that. Another way of articulating this is that it's potency, that it has potency or dynamism. This term tsalawa, that is to say, it has a kind of intrinsic dynamic to it, that it has a luster or radiance. That is to say, it's not flat or opaque, but it's radiance in the sense of that it has a dynamic like light has dynamic. And then third, that it is ropa means that it has play or display. That is to say that it is expressive, that it's not inert or still, but that it is fundamentally expressive and playful. Okay, so I just want to pause here because when we're talking about the features of non-dual awareness in this tradition, we're not talking about some kind of flat line, anesthetic, anesthesia rather, state that's content free or has no ability for expression, which is one, arguably, I would argue, one dominant way in current discourses around non-dual awareness that it is characterized. And according to these traditions, that's, as you'll see by these very simple descriptions, and I'll elaborate, that's not the case at all, right? It's dynamic, it's playful, it's caring, it's like light, etc. Okay. Another tripartite way that they talk about pure awareness or rigpa is that it's pervasive, that it's not here or there, it's not fragmented or discontinuous, but it's pervasive. That it's samrik, mind moving, that is to say, it's conscious awareness and it has a kind of movement on its own. That is to say, because it's self-automated, if you will, but here it has more of that quality of knowing, to know on its own, and that creates a kind of movement. And that it's primordial. That is to say, there was never a moment where it started, nor will be there a moment when it ends. It's atemporal, aspatial. And just as I made these asymmetrical distinguishments between ordinary awareness and pure awareness, so it's also the next level of discernment is to make between pure awareness and what get called remarkable experiences. And as a meditation researcher myself, this is something I'm very interested in. How do we discern remarkable experiences, which are experiences that can rise at any moment, but they are more prominent in meditation. We could probably correlate these if we wanted to extend the conversation to psychedelics, near-death experiences, and so on and so forth. There are moments when consciousness is altered in significant ways that are remarkable and that are emergent in, there's a whole paradigm for transformative learning and transformative experiences that I would argue remarkable experiences fall into. And these can be highly, subsuming and absorptive. and manifold. But the point is that these are not the nature of mind, that these can oftentimes be disguised as or misconstrued as pure awareness or the nature of mind, when in fact they're expressions of ordinary awareness. And anyways, these can be positively or negatively valenced. And I thought it important to draw attention to them. The word in Tibetan is nyam. These remarkable experiences that serve as a term for the wide range of experiential events that occur when the subject enters a state of deeply focused meditation. The most common defined trio of remarkable experiences: bliss, clarity, and non-thought. And I want to draw your attention to this because if we look at these, they can easily be misconstrued or understood on the surface to be the nature of mind, right? If we equate non-dual awareness with non-thought or bliss or clarity, and we define it as such, then it's easily confused with remarkable experiences. And nonetheless, there's a kind of qualitative content of these three kinds, and this is all again in the context of kind of meditation research. While these remarkable experiences are emergent, even predictable, they indicate signs of meditative progress, or they can, not realization of the nature of mind or pure awareness itself. Thus, these remarkable experiences also indicate a vacillation between the subjective stance and objective reference, such that experience bridges the subject-object intentionality. What's sort of more interesting in the conversation of non-dual awareness is that these remarkable experiences can serve as a kind of bridge for the collapse of the subject-object intentionality in complex ways that deserve attention, but again, can be misunderstood. The power of remarkable experiences to reflect the subject and object and thereby become blurred in salient absorptive states, like these remarkable experiences with the collapse of the subject-object complex and the emergence of non-dual awareness. All right. I'm going to sort of go through this quickly because I'm at time. I'm going to run through the Mahamudra very quickly, Laura, and then I'll go to my summary conclusion, okay?
Take your time, thank you.
So as I described the Dzogchen tradition, I'm now going to turn to another tradition called the Mahamudra tradition and provide a fourfold model, quadripartite. I don't use that word every day. Model. So anyways, this is one way that we think about in the Mahamudra tradition, modeling the nature of mind in a fourfold way. One is that appearances, that is to say, phenomenal object in the phenomenal world as the mind. That objects are perceived merely not apart from the mind, observing the color or the shape or the other features of phenomena. So this is important, but this kind of first gesture can often, if left as such, lead to a kind of solipsism or idealism or a kind of thinking that the mind is the world, right? So then they go on, and the second is that the mind itself then is empty, right? Therefore, appearances or the objective world is empty, which is the mind, but then the mind is empty. The subject that is perceiving is recognized as not having form or shape or color or weight itself, but as being not as being inside or outside and so forth. So first looking at the sort of phenomenal world as mind, and that the mind itself is empty, that does not have shape or color or phenomenal characteristics intrinsically. The third is that emptiness, that is to say, this kind of mind as devoid of any intrinsic, inherent pervasive substance is spontaneous presence. That is to say, the natural dynamic radiance of the mind expresses itself without obstruction as a diversity of appearances. That is to say, we've now turned from an exogenous mind world dynamic to an endogenous mind expression dynamic, where the mind itself, that is to say, pure awareness itself, is expressive in its manifold capacities. This, again, what I was talking in the Dzogchen paradigm of kind of dynamism and display and so forth of the mind, its expressive nature correlates with this third point. And fourth, that spontaneous presence, that is to say, the expressive nature of the mind as empty itself, is natural freedom, that the display of the mind is without alteration in its undistorted nature. And this is fundamental to these traditions, that there is a natural freedom, that there's an it's called Nondual. It means literally kind of self-liberative capacity of the mind, that the mind itself is automatically free. It doesn't need to be freed. It doesn't need to be unbound or unleashed, etc., that it's already like that. That's its fundamental undistorted nature. I had some descriptive accounts of pure awareness, but I think given time, I'm just going to sort of skip these and turn to my reflections. And so, just so you know, there's a whole kind of descriptive literature in the materials, the Tibetan materials I read around this, that can be quite poetic and also quite technical. Anyways, in conclusion, a non-dual model of consciousness. So we'll conclude where we began. There's a discernible underlying structured human experience that reifies a subject-object intentionality moment to moment, in such an architectonic gesture of consciousness shapes lived experience. Repeating myself, but it's bear repeating, and that these traditions that I am presenting, Tibetan Buddhist traditions, understand that this complex arc can be dismantled, dissolved, and disentangled via contemplative technique. That non-dual awareness is understood and reported to be fundamental, yet an operational model of non-dual awareness is missing from current prominent models or paradigms of consciousness. And I would argue today that we need to really, if we're going to think through paradigms of consciousness and consciousness science, start to think in more nuanced ways, which I haven't yet seen to date. And I am personally persuaded that historical traditions, including Buddhist traditions, have a lot to say about this that we can learn from. But more to the point, that a paradigm of consciousness must, if I may, include some understanding, a deep understanding of non-dual awareness to be a complete paradigm. And to characterize non-dual awareness as lived experience, a critical first step is disambiguating remarkable experiences from pure awareness. When I look at much of the research that's been done to date, there's serious conflation around what is non-dual awareness and what are some of these very, very cool and remarkable experiences, but nonetheless understood to be discrete from non-dual awareness, thus producing a more robust scholarship on the cognitive and cognitive operations of meta-awareness and reflexive awareness can bridge the mindfulness research with non-dual awareness. This is particularly targeted to meditation research thinking. I didn't talk much today about meta-awareness and reflexive awareness, but those are two critical faculties in meditation research for understanding the nature of mind or non-dual awareness that are descriptive from these traditions. So taking seriously historical sources, such as the 4 descriptions of the modes of rest, which is what I skipped through, can give us a more dynamic understanding of non-dual awareness. The point is here that we have descriptions of non-dual awareness, and that we can use these to our advantage for a more deeper understanding, synthesizing such descriptions of non-dual awareness with correlative neurophysiological measures, thinking here neurophenomenology, but even more so a kind of descriptive ontology of non-dual awareness that then maps with a kind of neuropheno paradigm, can yield a refined model of consciousness. Again, as I would argue, which must include non-dual awareness. And then in conclusion here, my sort of last point is developing a more nuanced phenomenology of micro gestures in the spectrum of effortful and effortless would help us understand degrees of awareness, still and influx. And here's my contact information if people want to reach out. And that was all one breath. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, very much appreciated. So everyone, please join in giving a round of applause. And
okay.
I have a small request, Michael. Feel free to say
no. Please.
But I was wondering, so I have lots of questions, and I was wondering whether I could forfeit my own questions and ask you to take us through these modes of rests. Maybe just take 5 minutes or so. Would that be a possibility? Because it would be super interesting to me, and I'm sure it would also be interesting to many people in the room.
Sure. Yeah. So I've given much more elaborate presentations on this. This is something I've been studying and translating these from meditation manuals from the Dzogchen tradition, and there are different descriptions of how the nature of mind expresses itself. I won't go into it in elaborate detail, but I will walk you through my slides, and a student of mine and myself are co-writing a paper on this, so hopefully someday we'll have something out there in the world to discuss it. But there are 4 predominantly, and sometimes you see 6 modes. These are, again, descriptive modes of pure awareness, and they're called resting modes. That is to say, they're called, in Tibetan we say chokshak. Chokshak je means the 4 resting modes, and they're literally how pure awareness rests or sort of abides on its own accord, on its own nature, without being perturbed or disturbed. And they do so in these kind of metaphoric manners of resting as a mountain, as an ocean, as pure awareness, and resting as visions. You'll also find descriptions of resting as the nature of phenomena and resting as spontaneity or spontaneous presence was the phrase I used earlier. And here I believe I focus mostly on the ocean. Let's see. Yeah, so these are little passages that I've selected from these texts, and I will read my translations here to give you guys an idea. For instance, when planets and stars, so again, this is a description of pure awareness as an ocean, right? That is to say, a description of pure awareness using the metaphor of like an ocean rests. Okay? This author, Tempe Wangchuk, who's relatively modern, 20th century, he says, for instance, when planets and stars manifest in the ocean, though the planets and stars appear, they are unperturbed by the water. So it's really beautiful. Imagine looking out on the ocean and it's still, and you can see the reflections from the cosmos of stars and planets on the water. Likewise, the field of appearances is unimpeded in the state of pure awareness. So he's then saying, just like you would see the star-speckled sky reflected on a still ocean in its vastness, in the same way, the field of appearances, that is to say, the phenomenal display of the world, is unimpeded in pure awareness. Similarly, though manifest, pure awareness is unperturbed from within the lucid and limpid state. That's called resting as an ocean. So he says, though it manifests, that is to say, it has this kind of reflective quality of phenomenal reflective quality, it's unperturbed. It's the ocean itself is unperturbed. That is to say, pure awareness itself doesn't make that. It doesn't sort of manipulate that. It doesn't sort of, try to select and discern as ordinary consciousness in my description above does, but it merely allows for this kind of lucid, limpid, unperturbed reflectivity. Okay, going on, he says regarding yogic, meaning here meditative practice, experiences and realizations will gradually arise while you progress along the contemplative path. As you deepen your meditative practice, and there's techniques for stabilizing recognition of pure awareness. And by relying on resting as an ocean, that is to say, understanding pure awareness as resting as an ocean, to be like an ocean that rests, you'll necessarily realize resting as pure awareness. So that is, he's saying through these techniques, and we're talking here about a very particular technique in Dzogchen meditation called cutting through, or trekcha, and where you're just sort of resting in phenomenal observations. And the more you do so, and you recognize its reflective capacity, like an ocean does with the stars, then pure awareness begins to become more prominent. And resting as pure awareness, now in this mode of resting as pure awareness, he says, is a different author, 17th century author. He says, is the essence of reflexive awareness that rests as effortless ease in the unfabricated natural state. This term reflexive awareness, I haven't had much time to talk about. I sort of had originally intended to, but it's really important. Okay, so there's the metaphor of reflection, which we just saw, the stars and planets on the vast ocean. But then there's also, like you can see in a mirror of reflection, that's the metaphor. But then there's reflexive, that is to say, the mind can know itself. And this is not something that's trained or acquired, but they say this is the capacity of awareness itself. And if we look across, known forms of consciousness, we as humans are the only species who has reflexive awareness. Now, there are other species, magpies and dolphins and crows and so forth, that have reflective awareness. That is to say, they can look in a mirror and recognize themselves, but that's different than recognizing awareness itself. Okay, so this is continuing with resting as pure awareness, to be an inexpressible by words, nor by the mind entangled. That is to say, this isn't something that is construed in concepts, nor is it something that the mind is entangled with. That is to say, the ordinary mind, but it is naturally settled, genuine, uncontrived, undistorted. This is, remember, pure awareness in its undistorted expression, as reality itself, dissolved within the expanse without qualifiers. Since meditation and meditative objects are without phenomena, dullness and agitation arise as naturally free. This is what I was talking about earlier. We talk about this kind of spontaneous presence is as expressive but fundamentally it's naturally free. This naturally manifests as the awakened mind. So there you go. Thank you.